Earthbound is a classic Japanese RPG for the Super Nintendo released in 1994, but the thing is, this game wasn't originally called Earthbound. Its name was changed to Earthbound when it was localized for Western audiences. Its original name is Mother 2, as this game is a sequel to the 1989 Mother 1. This strange name change isn't exclusive to Earthbound though. This happens a lot with video games. So I wondered, why do game names change when they're released in different countries? Well, in Earthbound's case, it's because naming your game after a relative is pretty weird. Would you really want to play a game called Second Cousin 2? The Japanese word for mother is okasan, and the Japanese word for 2 is ni. However, in Japan, the game uses the actual English words for the title. Sometimes Japanese games will use English words in their titles because it sounds foreign and cool. It's the same reason why we call piñatas piñatas instead of paper boxes filled with confetti and assorted candies. Using the English word mother also makes sense as Earthbound is heavily rooted in Western culture, being set in American-inspired towns and even including samples from various Western music artists. The name Mother, it just wouldn't work over here, so instead they changed the name to Earthbound, which makes sense considering you spend most of the game obtaining the power of the Earth from special locations called sanctuaries to stop an evil alien. It also makes sense because they use a drawing of the Earth in place of the O in Mother in the original Japanese version. If they did keep the name Mother, it would be odd because then Mother 2 would be called Mother 1 in the West as we didn't get the first game until much later, which means Mother 3 would then have to be called Mother 2 over here, and that would just make everything confusing. Several of the key people who worked on Earthbound also had a hand in the Pokemon series, and similarly to Earthbound, Pokemon also had a weird naming debacle with the Pokemon Stadium series. The first Pokemon Stadium never came over to the West, probably because it came out about 2 months before Pokemon Red and Blue were released outside of Japan. It probably would have done more harm than good to overwhelm consumers with 3 new games and a new series released all around the same time. The next game, Pokemon Stadium 2, would only come out 8 months later in Japan, but that game did get a Western release a little under a year later, although since we didn't get the original Pokemon Stadium, they just decided to call this game Pokemon Stadium. The next game in the series was Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver, and when that was released in the West, it was called Pokemon Stadium 2. Since the Japanese version didn't have a number in its title, fortunately, that means we can unify the game's titles from now on. So, Pokemon Stadium 3 will be the worldwide title for the next game in the series. Oh, definitely the most famous example of weird number changes in the game's series titles is the Final Fantasy series. While the original Final Fantasy did get a release in America, the next 2 games, Final Fantasy 2 and 3, were skipped. There actually were plans to release Final Fantasy II in the West, but outside of a few promotional images, little is known about that translation. The original Final Fantasy notoriously took an insanely long time to come out in America, releasing nearly 3 years after the Japanese version. By that point, 2 and 3 had already come out in Japan, and the Super Nintendo would be released in Japan only 4 months later, and the American release being only 9 months after that. At that point, it didn't really make much sense to waste time and resources translating 2 old games when Nintendo's new console was on its way. This also meant that the next game in the series, Final Fantasy IV, could get a faster localization, with the game releasing in America only 4 months after the Japanese version. Although when Final Fantasy IV came over to America, since we didn't get 2 or 3, Final Fantasy IV was called Final Fantasy II. Next up was Final Fantasy V. You would think since Square has, gotten a little bit faster at pumping out translations, it would be a no-brainer bringing over Final Fantasy V as Final Fantasy III, right? They skipped this one. I've heard rumors from poor sales of Final Fantasy IV in America to Final Fantasy V's lesser emphasis on story to Final Fantasy V's difficulty as to why Final Fantasy V on the Super Nintendo didn't make it out of Japan. Its unique job system is really cool as it gives the player a ton of freedom in how they want to customize their characters, but it also makes the game considerably more complex than your average Final Fantasy game at the time. While Final Fantasy V didn't make it out of the gulag, Final Fantasy VI did make its way over stateside only 6 months after its Japanese release, and that game had its name changed to Final Fantasy III. So, if you've been keeping up, in America, Final Fantasy I is Final Fantasy I, Final Fantasy II is Final Fantasy IV, and Final Fantasy III is Final Fantasy VI. This was obviously super confusing, so with the next game in the series, Final Fantasy VII, they decided to unify the game names and have Final Fantasy VII be the name of the game worldwide. It must have been really weird at the time to jump from 3 to 7. It was even worse in Europe because this was the first mainline Final Fantasy game they ever got. This would be be like if Nintendo suddenly released a new Mario game and jumped from Super Mario Bros. 3 all the way up to like Super Mario Bros. 13 or something. Is this even legal? Mario has been pretty good with keeping consistent game names across different regions, but if you look a little bit closer at some of the spin-offs, things tend to get a little wacky. Paper Mario is called Mario Story in Japan, referencing another N64 game, Yoshi's Story, which like Paper Mario has a unique storybook aesthetic. However, the next game, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, is called Paper Mario RPG in Japan. I mean, it makes sense considering Thousand Year Door uses the whole paper gimmick more than the original game, but it's just odd considering this was a case where the Japanese version adopted the name of the American version. The other Mario RPG series, the Mario and Luigi series, have different titles across different regions too. The first game in the series, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, is just called Mario and Luigi RPG in Japan. Can't lie, I dig the simplicity. The second game in the series, Mario & Luigi Partners in Time, is called Mario & Luigi RPG 2x2 on the Japanese box. A cute little reference to Baby Mario and Baby Luigi's importance in this game. The third game in the series, Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story, in Japan, is just called Mario & Luigi RPG 3. Oh, but this time they got 3 exclamation points in there. It took Japan until the fourth game, Mario & Luigi Dream Team, to add in a subtitle, Mario & Luigi RPG 4 Dream Adventure. In Europe, the game's name was changed to Mario & Luigi Dream Team Bros, just in case you forgot Mario and Luigi share a birth mother. In the last new game in the series, Mario and Luigi Paper Jam, Japan decided to drop the number and just call it Mario and Luigi RPG Paper Mario Mix. But Europe, still, they gotta remind you, just in case you didn't play the last game, that Mario and Luigi are in fact brothers. While Mario is fairly tame with its name changes, its sister series, the Zelda franchise, is a bit more liberal with its identity. The first game's title, The Legend of Zelda, is actually a subtitle in the Japanese version. The full name of the original Japanese version is The Hyrule Fantasy: The Legend of Zelda. I can see why they trimmed the fat on that one, it's just a bunch of words. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo is called The Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods in Japan. In the 90s, Nintendo of America was super strict on references to religion in their games, which is why the game was considerably censored. Some examples include words like priest being changed to sage, which also makes this image annoyingly off-center, and symbols based on Egyptian hieroglyphics being changed. The name Triforce of the Gods seems a little redundant if you know anything about Zelda lore, since it's long been established that the deities of Hyrule created the Triforce, but it actually makes sense if you take into account when this game came out. Before A Link to the Past came out in 1991, the nature of the Triforce was pretty unclear. It was just this weird thing that existed in Hyrule and possessed mysterious power. A Link to the Past was the first game to establish the lore behind the Triforce and its connection to the higher beings of Hyrule. Honestly, both titles fit really well. A Link to the Past makes sense as this game takes place before the first two Zelda games, and this game really delves into the lore of the Zelda series. And Triforce of the Gods makes sense as this game expands upon the importance of the Triforce in Hyrule's history. Interestingly, A Link to the Past sequel, A Link Between Worlds, is just straight up called Triforce of the Gods 2 in Japan. I prefer the English name, as they kept the spirit of the original game's title while still doing their own thing, whereas the Japanese name just adds a 2. Originally, there were plans to take A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo and make it for the Game Boy. This ended up becoming The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, released in 1993. The funny thing about Link's Awakening's Japanese name is, the name spoils the ending for the entire game. So, spoiler alert, I guess, if you care about the spoilers for a 30-year-old Game Boy game, but yeah, in Japan, this game is called The Legend of Zelda: Dreaming Island. Near the end of the game, you find out that the entire game takes place in a dream world. While I do think Dreaming Island sounds more interesting, I gotta give the English name credit as they managed to avoid spoiling, the entire game while still hinting subtly at the twist by calling it Link's Awakening, which you could easily misinterpret as just another generic title. Also, I dig how a lot of the early Zelda games' English titles managed to show my man Link some respect by actually putting his name in the title. Probably the most glaring title changes in the Zelda series came from the Oracle games released on the Game Boy's updated model, the Game Boy Color. I've seen a few different variations of the translation, so bear with me here, but roughly, in Japan, Oracle of Seasons is called the Mysterious Nut Earth Chapter, and Oracle of Ages is called the Mysterious Nut Spacetime Chapter. This is another one of those instances where I think the English names are just much more simple and compact. It is really strange, yet interesting how companies will change the names of their games for different reasons. I have a few other games I want to talk about, but to avoid this video getting too long, I'll save those for another time.